Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average deck list as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some quick swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. This series began a year and a half ago, and one of the very first videos was on Edgar Markov, one of the most popular commanders in the entire EDH format. Since Edgar just got married in Crimson Vow, I thought it would be a nice wedding gift to him to revisit his deck and see what it's up to these days. This is an Upping the Average Redux. We all know this guy, Mardu Vampire Tribal, with one of the best Eminence abilities we've ever seen, spitting out so many creatures that it's, frankly, scary. Though there are plenty of great Vampire Tribal choices out there, Edgar will always be top of the heap. We've gotten tons of new vampires over the past 2 years, and with the recent return to Innistrad, he's been getting tons more attention, and we've been inundated with requests to revisit this deck, so we're waking him up from his long slumber to see where his average deck is at today. In a word, it is stacked. This is an incredibly strong deck, often able to dominate a board state before opponents have time to set up. This commander's appeal has also caused the prices of cards in this deck to escalate over time, too. The Edgar card itself is a full sixth of this deck's price. No expense spared for the vamps, I suppose, but remember that any swaps made in the Upping the Average series must either keep the total price of the deck cost neutral or else help lower the overall cost of the deck. We're all familiar with the core cards for Edgar. Tiny vampires give us tons of tokens, and the vampire lords help turn that army into an immediately bloodthirsty mob. Most of the vampires stay slim, but a few of them have nice high impact effects at the top of the curve. With just a few supporting spells, all those bloodsuckers become an overwhelming bat-tallion. And of course, we have some newer cards that weren't out yet for the first Upping the Average video on Edgar. Damn, for example, is a beautifully flexible removal spell, and the new Welcoming Vampire is a great draw engine. Edgar's even showing up to his own wedding. Players are also loving the newish Nighthawk Scavenger, not to mention a few foppish Falcon Wraths that help out the deck's card draw. So, which changes would I make to this deck today? Since this is a Redux video, we won't have the usual section breakdowns, and we'll probably be pretty quick about the card swaps that we discuss. This will probably also cover some of the same ground as the previous Upping the Average for Edgar Markov, but that video was still back in the days of learning how to create and shape the Upping the Average series, so I don't even necessarily recommend watching it now. Here, I'll try and be quick, but still thorough. In any case, we're going to discuss some new swaps for Edgar today and cap it all off with budget honorable mentions at the end. First, some big cuts. Butcher of Malakir is 7 mana, and that's just too expensive for this effect. Edgar himself is often the top of our curve. Sanguine Bond is also nice, but the life gain theme in this deck is running very, very dry. So just like last time, I don't think we can justify it. There is a Veto in the list, but he's at least an actual vampire, which gives us tokens, and he enables his own ability, so he's a self-contained way to help our creatures push through the last bout of lethal damage. Sanguine Bond doesn't. It has a cool combo with Blood Tribute in the deck, but the thing is, I also recommend cutting the Blood Tribute. This list is so tight that I just don't think it has room for a life gain sub-theme, and this 2-card combo is kind of a distraction, which I suspect is the reason we've seen its popularity dip lower and lower for Edgar over time. Oh, and after all that, Mortify is the weakest removal spell after the deck is this tuned up. That quick round of cuts makes way for the thing this deck needs most of all: more card draw. These were some of my primary additions the first time I examined Edgar, and they're still not seeing enough love in his deck data. More cards means we get more vampires, which means more death. These are great to push our advantage and to make sure we never run out of steam, even if we encounter enemy wrath effects. Minions Murmurs was my favorite add for the deck, but in the intervening years, we've also seen the arrival of Pact of the Serpent, which is utterly perfect for a deck that gets this many bodies on the battlefield. If Champion of Dusk is one of Edgar's most played cards, then these ought to see more play too. Moving on, let's get to a few specific swap-overs. I don't think the Sorin and the Sorin make the cut. One cheats vampires into play, but we don't even have a huge number of expensive vampires where this would be worth cheating that mana cost. And as for the other, I don't even think this is the best 4-mana Sorin available. I'd rather exchange these for actual vampires that will give us tokens from Edgar's Eminence ability. Mirror Entity is one of the best vampires this deck isn't yet playing. It comes with 2 bodies and it utterly ruins our opponent's combat math. And I've also long been a champion of the somewhat obscure Thirsting Bloodlord. Like the new Edgar Charmed Groom, who's showing up in a bunch of Edgar Markov decks right now, he's a 4-mana vampire lord. Little buffs like this go a really long way when you have upwards of 8 creatures on the board all the time. Moving along, Knight of the Ebon Legion has never truly thrilled me, but I have been very impressed by Shadow Alley Denizen. Every vampire we cast makes something else much harder to block, which can give us the necessary poke to slip past tricky opponents, especially enemies with protection or lifelink. Blade of the Blood Chief, meanwhile, impresses me in other decks, but not in this one. If we pump up many creatures, we'll deal way more damage than if we just make a single big vampire. Instead of this, I'd much prefer to include one of the newish vampires from Zendikar Rising, Null Priest of Oblivion. The versatility on this thing is just great. Come down early to get the party started, or be a helpful late game draw to bring a long-lost friend back from the yard to get things kicking back up all over again. Finally, Stensia Masquerade is so 14th century, far out of fashion for these glamorous wedding guests. I cannot recommend enough the card Mercadia's Downfall. I've been banging this drum for 2 years and the data on it is still super low. This card wins games. Put it into your decks immediately. That does it for my official swaps, but let's quickly cover some honorable mentions. This is an expensive deck, so if you're trying to play it on a friendlier budget, what options are available out there? Edgar himself is again one of the most expensive cards in the entire deck, a full sixth of the deck's budget all on his own, but we can still cut the price of the rest of this deck by more than half. Anguished Unmaking, Demonic Tutor, and Anointed Procession are all awesome, but so are their price tags. So what could we exchange them with? The new Olivia's Wrath looks to be cheap so far, and it could be a very one-sided form of removal. This card doesn't help when you fall in behind, so it can be very swingy, but it's still worth a look, especially at that price tag. Patriarch's Bidding is also finally less than $2, a great way to reclaim your advantage if you're looking for ways to claw back into the game. Crimson Vow also contains a few creatures like Dominating Vampire that are pretty good at being aggro and which don't look likely to cost very much to acquire. In fact, there are several pricey vampires in this average deck that you can find perfectly good replacements for. Dusk Legion Zealot, for example, is going to be 2 bodies and it will replace itself. Graces the wheels perfectly well. Scion of Opulence will resupply you with mana if you experience a setback. And if there are any annoying artifacts out there, the new Arsonist is pretty darn funny. This effect is restricted, but it still blows up equipment, mystic forges, artifact creatures, citadels, reservoirs, and that's all pretty darn cool. To round things out on these expensive swaps, there are also some cards like Phyrexian Arena, which can instead be replaced with stuff like Idol of Oblivion, which is also likely to help draw an extra card per turn. Teferi's Protection came in the original Edgar Precon, but it's a pricey card, and if you don't have one, there are a lot of budget-friendly protection spells out there too. If you specifically want the phasing from this ability to protect yourself from bounce or exile, it's not a huge sin to play a non-vampire Guardian of Faith in this deck to help your tokens survive the dawn. Oh, and of course, don't be afraid to play more lands in this deck either. The average deck contains 33, and that is slim, probably something Edgar only gets away with when he's optimized to the T. If you're playing on a lower budget, a few more lands will help out with consistency. And, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that over $50 of this deck's budget is contained in the mana base alone. These expensive cards can always be substituted with perfectly fine budget lands too. These swaps save over $250 on the deck's price, and I'll have a link in the description below that contains these budget exchanges if you'd like to check it out. Lastly, what about the opposite end? If you're optimizing this deck even more, what do the more expensive swaps look like for this deck? Well, first, it should be noted that optimizing this deck even further means you're probably not playing anything that costs 5 mana or more. An optimized version of an Edgar deck ignores even some of the coolest 6-drops and focuses instead upon tons and tons and tons of 1 and 2 drop vampires. This isn't the direction every Edgar player takes, which is why that's not the direction I went in this video, but it is definitely worth noting that optimized Edgar decks don't just use super expensive cards. They also use very cheap cards in a very thrillingly cutthroat way. For example, the new Olivia Crimson Bride is a little expensive to acquire right now, and I'd bet that super optimized Edgar decks probably won't even want it, since 6 mana would cost way too much. It is a pretty neat card though, even if Edgar might end up leaving her at the altar. In truth, the main upgrades to big-budget Edgar decks will mostly be contained in the mana base. Spicier mana bases will round out the suite of fetch lands, battle bond lands, and the currently available Horizon lands in this color combination. And aside from that, I think Vampire Nocturnus and Bolas' Citadel are the next pursuits for an indulgent Edgar deck. Nocturnus' reward isn't consistent, but the odds are better than I expected, working just under 50% of the time. And the Citadel is just gas. Even if 6 mana is the top of the curve for this deck, casting a Citadel is never just casting a Citadel. This will take Edgar from 0 to 60 without batting an eye. So there we have it. I hope Edgar enjoys his honeymoon with this new setup. A link to this deck list along with the other more budget-friendly list can be found in the description below, with the cuts in the maybe board. Let me know what you think of this revisitation to Markov Manor. Are there any commanders that you would like to see get a Redux, or other commanders that you'd like to see in future Upping the Average videos? Let me know down below, and thanks as always for watching.